Every royal dynasty has its star, the monarch who defines an era. But behind every throne there is a line of shadows, the heirs, the spares, the ones who stand and wait. And sometimes the most fascinating story belongs not to the one who wears the crown, but to the one who was supposed to. This is the story of such a man. He was born to be the king of Great Britain and Ireland and emperor of India. He was the grandson of the great Queen Victoria, the eldest son of the heir. And from the moment he drew breath, he was second in line to the most powerful throne on earth. But history remembers him not for the crown he never wore, but for the darkness that clings to his name. Whispers of incompetence, rumors of a secret, decadent life, and a shocking, persistent accusation that connects his name to the blood-soaked alleys of Whitechapel and the most infamous series of unsolved murders in history. He was Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, known to his family simply as Eddy. His short, tragic life and the scandalous legacy that followed have made him one of the most enigmatic figures in the history of the House of Windsor. So, who was the real Prince Eddy? Was he a dangerously unstable liability who would have destroyed the monarchy? Or was he the tragic victim of a cruel fate and more than a century of unrelenting slander? To truly understand Prince Eddy, you have to understand the world he was born into. This was Britain in the latter half of the 19th century, the zenith of the Victorian era. The British Empire, a sprawling colossus of dominions, colonies, and territories, covered a quarter of the globe. By the late 19th century, particularly around the 1880s and 1890s, the empire had reached its territorial peak, encompassing approximately 13.7 million square miles of land and ruling over roughly 458 million people, which amounted to about 1/5 of the world's population at the time. This vast domain stretched across every continent, including key holdings in India, where the British Raj administered a subcontinent of over 250 million people through a network of civil servants, railways, and telegraphs that facilitated economic extraction and control. In Africa, territories like Egypt, South Africa, and parts of West Africa were under British influence, often secured through military campaigns, such as the Anglo-Zulu War of 1879 or the Mahdist War in Sudan during the 1880s. Asia featured crown jewels like Hong Kong, seized after the Opium Wars, and Singapore as a strategic trading hub. The Americas included Canada, fully confederated in 1867, and the Caribbean islands, while Australasia boasted Australia and New Zealand as settler colonies. From the grand administrative buildings of New Delhi, where the Viceroy's house symbolized imperial authority, to the bustling ports of Hong Kong, which handled immense trade in tea, opium, and manufactured goods, the Union Jack flew as a symbol of unparalleled power. This era saw Britain as the world's leading industrial and financial powerhouse, with its navy dominating the seas, enforcing the Pax Britannica, and its economy driven by the Industrial Revolution's innovations in steam power, textiles, and railways. Britain's gross domestic product accounted for about 9% of the global total by 1870, and its merchant fleet carried over half of the world's seaborne trade. It was an age of immense, almost arrogant confidence, a nation that saw itself as the pinnacle of civilization, on a divine mission to bring its version of progress and order to the world. This self-perception was fueled by ideologies like social Darwinism and the civilizing mission, justifying colonial expansion as a moral imperative to uplift lesser races through education, Christianity, and governance. Figures like Rudyard Kipling captured this in works such as The White Man's Burden, published in 1899, which portrayed imperialism as a noble, if burdensome, duty. Scientific advancements, from Charles Darwin's theories to the telegraph connecting London to Bombay in minutes, reinforce this sense of superiority, while exhibitions like the Great Exhibition of 1851 in the Crystal Palace showcased British ingenuity to millions. But this grand imperial facade concealed a society of stark and often brutal contradictions. This was the Britain of Charles Dickens, a nation of two cities, often existing side by side, as vividly depicted in novels like Oliver Twist, 1838, and Bleak House, 1853, which exposed the underbelly of urban industrialization. There was the London of grand cream-colored townhouses in Mayfair and Belgravia, districts developed in the early 19th century with neoclassical architecture by builders like Thomas Cubitt, housing the aristocracy and a rising class of industrial magnates enriched by coal, steel, and railways. These elites frequented exclusive gentlemen's clubs in Pall Mall, such as the Reform Club, founded 1836, or the Athenaeum, 1824, where membership required social standing and wealth, and discussions ranged from politics to investments over port and cigars. Their lives were marked by unimaginable luxury, households staffed by dozens of servants, including butlers, footmen, maids, and cooks, who adhered to strict hierarchies outlined in manuals like Mrs. Beeton's Book of Household Management, 1861. Lavish dinner parties featured multi-course meals with French cuisine, fine china, and silverware, while country house weekends at estates like Blenheim Palace or Sandringham involved hunting, balls, and networking among the peerage. Wealth disparities were extreme. The top 1% of society controlled about 70% of the nation's wealth by the 1860s, with fortunes built on factories, mines, and colonial trade. And then, just a few miles to the east, there was the London of the slums, a sprawling, smoke-choked labyrinth of poverty and despair. In places like Whitechapel and Spitalfields, the very streets that Jack the Ripper would soon make infamous with his murders of 5 women in 1888, millions lived in desperate squalor, stalked by disease, crime, and grinding poverty. Overcrowding was rampant. The population of London exploded from 1 million in 1801 to over 6.5 million by 1901, driven by rural migration and Irish immigration during the Potato Famine, 1845 to 1852. Slums consisted of rookeries, crumbling tenements with shared rooms housing entire families, often without sanitation or running water. Reports from social reformers like Henry Mayhew in London Labour and the London Poor, 1851, detailed conditions where up to 20 people crammed into single rooms, sleeping on straw amid vermin. Cholera epidemics such as the 1854 outbreak in Soho that killed over 600 due to contaminated water highlighted the lack of infrastructure. Raw sewage flowed into the Thames, the city's drinking source. Infant mortality rates in Whitechapel reached 200 per 1,000 births, double the national average, while life expectancy hovered around 30 years for the working poor. Crime flourished in these shadows, with gangs like the High Rippers preying on the vulnerable, and prostitution, estimated at 80,000 women in London alone, served as a desperate survival mechanism amid unemployment from mechanization. Charitable efforts, such as those by the Salvation Army, founded 1865 by William Booth, provided soup kitchens and shelters, but systemic issues like low wages, averaging 15 to 20 shillings weekly for laborers, and child labor in factories persisted as documented in parliamentary blue books on poverty. This glaring inequality was papered over by a rigid code of public morality. Reputation was everything in Victorian society, where social standing could be shattered by scandal, leading to ostracism or financial ruin. A strict and often deeply hypocritical set of rules governed behavior, especially for the upper classes. One was expected to be pious, dutiful, and sexually restrained, at least in public, influenced by evangelical Christianity and the Queen's own emphasis on family values. The Church of England promoted Sunday observance, temperance, and philanthropy, while literature like Samuel Smiles's Self-Help, 1859, extolled virtues of thrift and hard work. Marriage was sacrosanct, with divorce rare until the Matrimonial Causes Act of 1857, and adultery could destroy reputations, as seen in high-profile cases. Yet beneath this veneer of respectability, a thriving underworld of vice, gambling, and prostitution catered to the very men who publicly preached the highest moral standards. London's West End housed discreet brothels, like those in St. James's Street, frequented by aristocrats, while the Cremorne Gardens offered illicit pleasures under the guise of pleasure gardens. Hypocrisy was rampant. Politicians decrying immorality often engaged in extramarital affairs, and the Contagious Diseases Acts, 1864 to 1869, regulated prostitution to protect soldiers from venereal disease while ignoring women's rights. As Oscar Wilde later satirized in The Importance of Being Earnest, 1895, the era's moral code was a facade with double lives common among the elite, public virtue masking private vice. This duality extended to empire, where civilizing rhetoric justified exploitation, yet colonial administrators indulged in local customs they condemned at home. At the very top of this social pyramid sat the royal family, who were expected to be the ultimate, flawless embodiment of dignity, duty, and moral rectitude. As the symbolic head of state and church, the monarchy was scrutinized through newspapers like the Times, which amplified any lapse. Queen Victoria's court set the tone for national behavior, with protocols dictating everything from dress to conversation. The matriarch of this world was Queen Victoria. By the time Eddy was born in 1864, she had been on the throne for nearly 3 decades, ascending in 1837 at age 18 and reigning until 1901. After the death of her beloved husband, Prince Albert, from typhoid fever on December 14, 1861, at Windsor Castle, she retreated into a state of perpetual theatrical mourning, casting a long, somber shadow over the country and her court. Albert's passing, at age 42, devastated Victoria, who described it as the end of her happiness in her journals, leading her to wear black for the remaining 40 years of her life. She withdrew from public duties for nearly a decade, earning the nickname Widow of Windsor from satirical publications like Punch, which criticized her seclusion as neglectful. The Victorian court became a place of rigid, almost suffocating formality, governed by strict etiquette and draped in black. Mourning protocols were elaborate. Household staff wore black armbands, and the Queen mandated half mourning, grays and lavenders, after initial full black. Windsor Castle was preserved as a shrine to Albert, with his rooms untouched, blue rooms, his favorite color, maintained and hot water brought daily as if he were alive. This extended grief influenced national culture, popularizing mourning jewelry like jet brooches and lockets containing hair of the deceased, and customs such as covering mirrors during funerals. Victoria's absence strained the monarchy's popularity, with Republican sentiments rising in the 1860s, fueled by pamphlets like What Does She Do With It?, questioning her civil list funding. The Queen herself, the widow of Windsor, was a remote and formidable figure, a living symbol of a nation's grief, communicating via notes and rarely appearing in Parliament. Her influence felt through letters to ministers like Gladstone and Disraeli. Her eldest son and heir, Albert Edward, known as Bertie, was the absolute opposite of his austere mother. Born in 1841, Bertie embodied the excesses of the era's elite, leading a fast, fashionable, and often scandalous social circle known as the Marlborough House Set, named after his London residence granted in 1863. This group included aristocrats, actresses, and industrialists like the Rothschilds indulging in shooting parties, yachting on the Riviera, and Parisian soirees. The Prince of Wales was a pleasure-loving man, famous for his appetites for fine food, dining on multi-course feasts at clubs like Rule's, beautiful women, and high-stakes gambling at casinos in Monte Carlo or Baden-Baden. His indiscretions were legendary and a constant source of frustration for the Queen, who viewed him as unfit, writing in letters of her despair over his frivolous ways. He was dragged into the center of the messy Mordaunt divorce case in 1870, when Sir Charles Mordaunt, a Conservative MP, sued his wife Harriet for adultery, citing Bertie among her lovers based on letters found in her possession. The trial at the divorce court in Westminster Hall forced the prince to testify, denying impropriety but admitting visits, a profound humiliation for the monarchy, as newspapers sensationalized the royal scandal, eroding public trust. Later, in 1890 to 1891, he was a key figure in the Tranby Croft Baccarat scandal, where during a house party at the Yorkshire estate of ship owner Arthur Wilson, Lieutenant Colonel Sir William Gordon Cumming was accused of cheating at baccarat, a card game Bertie had organized. The ensuing slander trial in 1891 exposed Bertie's gambling habits. Stakes reached £100 per hand, and his signing of a confidentiality agreement, further tarnishing the Crown's image as Republican newspapers, like Reynolds's newspaper, lambasted the idle rich. While the Queen embodied a rigid and somber morality, her heir Bertie embodied the era's hedonistic excesses. To Victoria and the establishment, his behavior was a constant threat, and she confided in her private journals the deep-seated fear that her own son would one day ruin the monarchy. This created immense pressure on the next generation. With the Queen in seclusion, limiting court life to Balmoral or Osborne House, and her heir seen as a dangerously frivolous liability, his lifestyle costing an estimated £100,000 annually beyond his allowance, the nation looked to Bertie's children to be the saviors of the monarchy's reputation. Prince Albert Victor Christian Edward was born on January 8, 1864, at Frogmore House, Windsor. His arrival was dramatic and perilous. He came into the world 2 months prematurely, a tiny, fragile infant whose survival was far from certain in an age before modern neonatal care. Weighing less than 4 pounds at birth, as recorded by the attending physician Sir Charles Locock, Eddy required constant monitoring in the initial weeks, with nurses employing basic methods like wrapping him in cotton wool for warmth and feeding him through droppers, common practices for premature infants in the 1860s, when survival rates for such births were below 50% due to risks of respiratory distress, infections, and underdeveloped organs. From his very first moments, a narrative of weakness and vulnerability began to form around him, a narrative that would follow him for the rest of his life, as family letters and court records repeatedly referenced his early health scares, including frequent fevers and a general delicacy that limited his physical activities in childhood. This fragility was thrown into sharp relief by the arrival of his younger brother, Prince George, the future King George V, just a year and a half later, on June 3rd, 1865. Where Eddy was quiet and placid, often content with solitary pursuits like sketching or observing others during family gatherings at Sandringham, George was robust, energetic, and bright, displaying an early aptitude for outdoor games and quick learning that endeared him to tutors and relatives alike. The two boys were placed under the care of the Reverend John Neal Dalton, a tutor who was tasked with the immense responsibility of molding them into future kings. Dalton, appointed in 1871 and serving until 1879, was a Cambridge-educated clergyman known for his strict moral code and emphasis on discipline, overseeing their education in a dedicated schoolroom at Sandringham, with a curriculum heavy on classics, history, and religious studies. Dalton's meticulous diaries and reports to the Queen, preserved in the Royal Archives and numbering dozens of entries from 1871 to 1879, paint a painful and relentless picture of Eddy's academic struggles. He describes the young prince's mind as abnormally dormant in reports from 1873, noting persistent difficulties in retaining information, and complains of his slovenly and inaccurate work in arithmetic exercises where Eddy repeatedly miscalculated basic sums, or in Latin conjugations, where errors in verb forms were common despite repeated corrections. Day after day, sitting in the schoolroom at Sandringham, struggling to grasp a lesson in Latin or mathematics, while his younger brother sat beside him, mastering it with ease. The room, furnished with oak desks, globes, and blackboards, hosted sessions from morning until evening, with Dalton enforcing a regime of rote memorization and written tests. Every lesson became a competition he could not win, as Dalton's comparative assessments highlighted George's alert mind against Eddy's want of concentration. Every report a confirmation of his inadequacy, leading to extended study hours for Eddy alone. It's now believed that his premature birth may have left him with mild hearing loss, impairing his ability to follow verbal instructions clearly, and potentially a learning disability like dyslexia, which would explain his challenges with reading fluency and spelling accuracy noted in Dalton's logs from 1872 to 1875. In the rigid, unforgiving Victorian education system, these conditions were not understood. Medical texts of the era, such as those by John Langdon Down, classified such issues under broad terms like feeble-mindedness without diagnostic nuance. They were simply seen as moral failings, as evidence of laziness or a lack of character, with punishments like withheld privileges or extra assignments applied to correct them. And so from his earliest childhood, Eddy was trapped in a cycle of failure and criticism. In 1879, in a grand effort to shape them into men worthy of the empire, the two princes, now teenagers at ages 15 and 14, were sent on a 3-year world tour aboard the naval vessel HMS Bacante. This was the ultimate imperial field trip, designed to instill naval discipline and show them the vastness of the British domains, with an itinerary spanning over 50,000 miles and visits to more than 20 countries, including stops in the Mediterranean, South America, Australia, Asia, and Africa, under the command of Captain Lord Scott. For George, the journey was a resounding success. He loved the structure and the clear sense of purpose of the Royal Navy, actively participating in deck duties, learning rope work, and engaging in gunnery practice, skills that paved the way for his later promotions to sub-lieutenant in 1884. For Eddy, it was largely another ordeal. He was often seasick, suffering from prolonged bouts during Atlantic crossings and monsoons in the Indian Ocean, as detailed in the ship's medical logs, and showed little interest in the technical aspects of navigation or gunnery, such as plotting courses with sextants or loading cannons, preferring instead to observe from the quarterdeck. Their tutor, Dalton, who accompanied them as chaplain, continued his stream of critical reports, complaining that Eddy was listless, easily distracted by onboard leisure-like card games, and preferred the glamour of social receptions in ports like Sydney, where they attended a state ball hosted by Governor Lord Augustus Loftus on February 5, 1881, with fireworks and dances, or Cape Town, participating in dinners with colonial officials in April 1881 amid Table Mountain views, to the hard work of being a naval cadet, including night watches and sail repairs during storms. There were, however, moments of youthful rebellion that punctuated the routine. During their visit to Japan from July to September 1881, both brothers famously got tattoos at a Yokohama studio run by artist Horichio, a blue and red dragon on George's arm and a pair of storks on Eddy's chest, as recounted in their published journal, The Cruise of HMS Bacante, 1886. The news scandalized their grandmother, Queen Victoria, who wrote in her journal on October 20th, 1881, of her horror and disgust at the vulgar act, viewing it as unbecoming for royalty, but it was a rare sign of the independent spirit that the rigid educational program sought to suppress, offering a brief assertion of personal choice amid constant oversight. After the Bacante tour returned in 1882, docking at Spithead on August 11th amid naval salutes, the paths of the two brothers finally diverged. George, the successful one, was allowed to continue his naval career, joining HMS Canada in the North America and West Indies station for active service until 1885. For Eddy, the future king, another path had to be found. He was sent to Trinity College, Cambridge, enrolling in October 1883 at age 19, but it was clear this was not a genuine academic pursuit. A special curriculum was designed for him by the college master, focusing on non-examined subjects like constitutional history and French literature. He was not required to sit exams or matriculate formally, and he was provided with a minder, his former tutor James Kenneth Stephen, a poet and fellow appointed to supervise his daily routine and prevent indiscretions. The real purpose was to expose him to the sons of the British establishment through memberships in societies like the Apostles Discussion Group and attendance at university events. Socially, he was a success, forming friendships with peers like Lord Rosebery's sons, and participating in college life with his noted, gentle manners in conversations, his kindness in supporting student charities, and his impeccable dress sense in bespoke tails and top hats. But he showed no intellectual spark, as tutors' notes indicate minimal participation in seminars and a preference for social outings over library study. From Cambridge, he was commissioned into the 10th Hussars, a prestigious cavalry regiment, in June 1885 at age 21, stationed initially at Aldershot Garrison. The army, like the university, was seen as a respectable place to place the prince, a structured environment where he could be supervised under regimental routines of parades, drills, and equestrian training. He seemed to enjoy the camaraderie, bonding with officers like Lord Arthur Somerset during mess halls and fox hunts, sharing stories and building loyalties that lasted. But it was here that his reputation for a decadent lifestyle began to take shape. He fell in with a fast pleasure-seeking crowd, including members of the Marlborough House set, and whispers of his involvement in gambling at venues like the Turf Club, where stakes reached hundreds of pounds on card games, and late-night parties at West End theaters or private salons began to circulate, causing deep anxiety back at the palace. as evidenced in Queen Victoria's letters expressing fears of scandalous associations mirroring his father's. There was one brief shining moment where Eddy seemed to find his footing. In 1889, he embarked on a grand tour of British India, departing in October 1889 and returning in May 1890, a 7-month journey covering over 10,000 miles by train and ship. For months he traveled across the subcontinent, attending lavish receptions in Bombay with fireworks displays upon arrival on November 9, 1889, meeting with Maharajas like the Gaikwad of Baroda at Durbars, featuring jewel-encrusted thrones and elephant parades, and participating in tiger hunts in the Terai region near Nepal, where he bagged several animals using howdahs on elephant backs. Here, in the highly ceremonial and deferential world of the Raj, with its protocols of gun salutes, 19 for a royal duke, and state banquets hosted by Viceroy Lord Lansdowne in Calcutta, he didn't need to be an intellectual or a warrior. He simply had to be a prince, laying foundation stones for hospitals in Madras or reviewing troops in Lahore. For the first time in his life, he was in a role that suited him, and by all accounts, he excelled at it, carrying out his duties with a newfound dignity and charm, as reported in the Times dispatches praising his affable interactions with local rulers and positive reception among colonial officials, boosting Anglo-Indian ties. The successful tour gave his family a glimmer of hope, and with his reputation somewhat restored, they turned to the final crucial step in securing the monarchy's future, finding the prince a suitable wife. History has not been kind to Prince Albert Victor. The popular image that has endured is a caricature, the dim-witted, decadent playboy prince, a listless and lazy heir who was more interested in the gambling tables and music halls of London than in the affairs of state. He has become a symbol of royal inadequacy, a footnote in history remembered mostly for the scandals that swirled around him. But is that caricature the truth? When we strip away the layers of rumor and a century of slander, the man who emerges is someone far more complex and far more tragic. Those who actually knew Prince Eddy personally painted a remarkably consistent and very different portrait. The words that appear again and again in private letters, diaries, and memoirs are not stupid or vicious, but gentle, kind, charming, and unfailingly polite. He was, by all accounts, a sweet-natured and affectionate young man. He was known to be a loyal friend to his small circle of army comrades, and he treated household staff with a kindness and consideration that was not always common among the aristocracy. This creates the central paradox of his character, a man who was almost universally liked on a personal level, but was widely considered a failure on a public one. He was a man with a good heart, but one who seemed utterly unsuited for the ruthless demands of his destiny. To understand this disconnect, we have to look at the immense psychological pressure of his upbringing. This immense psychological pressure was, of course, magnified by the constant presence of his younger brother George. This was not a hostile or aggressive rivalry. By all accounts, the brothers were personally fond of one another. But George's very existence served as a constant, painful yardstick against which Eddy was always measured and always found wanting. In the schoolroom, George was quick and diligent, while Eddy was slow and distracted. On the naval tour, George was a natural sailor, while Eddy was often seasick and disengaged. George was boisterous, confident, and dutiful. Eddy became quiet, withdrawn, and plagued by a profound lack of confidence. This was reinforced by his relationship with his father Bertie, the Prince of Wales. Bertie, for all his faults, was a man of immense charm, wit, and social intelligence. He was reportedly often frustrated and impatient with his slow, languid eldest son. For a young man desperate for paternal approval, this constant disappointment from his powerful father would have been devastating. After years of being told that he was slow and incapable, he seems to have simply accepted it as the truth. Why strive to succeed when everyone in your life expects you to fail? The apathy his tutors complained about may not have been laziness, but a symptom of profound despair. The apathy his tutors so often complained about may not have been a sign of laziness, but a symptom of despair. In this world of constant judgment and impossible expectations, Eddy had one fierce and unwavering ally, his mother Alexandra, the Princess of Wales. Their bond was exceptionally close and deeply emotional. Alexandra herself was no stranger to feeling like an outsider. A Danish princess in a German-dominated court, she also suffered from severe hearing loss as a result of a childhood illness, a condition that left her feeling isolated. It is highly probable that she recognized a similar vulnerability in her eldest son. There is significant evidence that Eddy too suffered from a mild form of deafness, perhaps a result of his premature birth. For Alexandra, this shared struggle may have created a special, unspoken bond of empathy. She was fiercely protective of him, refusing to hear a word of criticism against her dear, dear Eddy. While his father and grandmother fretted about the succession, Alexandra simply loved her son unconditionally. Her letters are filled with overflowing affection and concern for his well-being. She was his refuge, his staunchest defender in a world that seemed determined to break his spirit. Her unconditional love was likely his only real source of emotional support in the constant storm of his royal life. Given this context, his attraction to the easygoing, pleasure-seeking social sets at Cambridge and in the army can be seen in a new light. It was not necessarily a sign of a flawed moral character, but a desperate search for acceptance. In the company of his hussar comrades, in the private rooms of London's clubs, he wasn't the disappointing heir to the throne. He wasn't being judged on his intellect or his suitability to be king. He was accepted for his charm, his title, and his gentle, unassuming good nature. These friendships, however ill-advised some of them may have been, offered a refuge from the constant pressure and criticism of his official life. It was a world where he could, for a moment, simply be Eddy. This, then, is the portrait of the man behind the scandals, a young prince of a gentle and kindly spirit, burdened by deep-seated insecurities, crushed by the impossible expectations of his role, and constantly overshadowed by a more capable brother. He found solace only in the unconditional love of his mother and the uncritical companionship of his friends. It is this very vulnerability, this quiet desperation for acceptance and escape, that would make him such a perfect target for the dark and vicious rumors that were about to engulf him, and which would come to define his legacy. His life story is inextricably linked with two of the most infamous scandals of the Victorian era, a cloud of rumor and accusation that has followed him long after his death. Our first stop is the notorious Cleveland Street scandal of 1889. In the heart of London, police investigating petty theft by post office telegraph boys stumbled upon something far more explosive, a male brothel operating out of an unassuming house on Cleveland Street. This establishment catered to the wealthy and the aristocratic, providing the services of young telegraph boys. In the deeply homophobic and repressive society of Victorian Britain, the discovery threatened to trigger a scandal that could shake the establishment to its core. As the investigation proceeded, it became clear that the brothel's client list reached into the highest echelons of the British establishment. A key figure, Lord Arthur Somerset, was an equerry and a close friend to Eddy's father, the Prince of Wales. Another client was the Earl of Euston. As the names of powerful men began to circulate, the government, led by the Prime Minister Lord Salisbury, seemed to panic. The investigation was deliberately slowed, key evidence went missing, and the brothel's proprietor and high-profile clients like Lord Arthur Somerset were given ample time to flee the country, escaping justice. It was in this atmosphere of cover-up and conspiracy that the whispers began. The radical press, always eager to embarrass the monarchy, started to hint that a far more important person was being protected. In the private clubs of Pall Mall and the drawing rooms of Mayfair, a name was put to the rumor: Prince Albert Victor. So, was he involved? The truth is, there has never been a single piece of credible, direct evidence to prove that Prince Eddy ever set foot in the Cleveland Street brothel. The entire accusation rests on hearsay, on the claims of blackmailers, and on the suspicious nature of the official cover-up. The consensus among most serious modern biographers is that he was likely not a client. But in a way, the truth hardly mattered. The frantic efforts by the government to protect the Prince of Wales's circle, and by extension the monarchy itself, made them look profoundly guilty. The scandal permanently cemented in the public mind an image of Prince Eddy as a dissolute and decadent figure, a man connected to a secret, sordid underworld that was the very antithesis of the royal family's carefully curated public image. The mud had been thrown, and it stuck. While the Cleveland Street affair damaged his reputation, the next scandal would completely overshadow it, posthumously linking his name to a far darker story. This is the dark, lurid, and utterly captivating accusation that Prince Eddy was, in fact, the most infamous serial killer in history, Jack the Ripper. It's important to state from the outset that this theory is a much more modern invention. It did not exist during Eddy's lifetime. It first gained prominence in the 1960s and 70s and has since spawned countless books, documentaries, and movies, solidifying itself in the popular imagination. The theories vary, but they often allege that the prince, driven mad by syphilis, stalked the dark alleys of Whitechapel, carrying out the gruesome murders. Another popular version claims the murders were part of a complex Masonic conspiracy orchestrated by the royal physician Sir William Gull to silence a group of prostitutes who knew of Eddy's secret marriage to a Catholic shopgirl. It's a sensational story, a perfect cocktail of royal intrigue and true crime, but it has one fundamental, insurmountable problem. It is impossible. The historical record provides a clear and verifiable alibi for Prince Eddy that places him far from London during the times of the most significant murders. Let's look at the facts. The canonical 5 Ripper murders took place in the autumn of 1888. Official court records, family letters, police diaries, and newspaper reports, including the court circular, which documented the royal family's official movements, allow us to trace Eddy's whereabouts with a high degree of certainty. On the night of August 31st, when the first victim, Mary Ann Nichols, was killed, Eddy was in Yorkshire, visiting an army barracks. On September 8th, when Annie Chapman was murdered, he was still in Yorkshire. But the most conclusive evidence comes on the night of the double event, September 30th, when 2 women, Elizabeth Stride and Catherine Eddowes, were killed in the same night. On that date, Prince Eddy was over 500 miles away from the crime scenes, at the royal estate of Balmoral in Scotland. His grandmother, Queen Victoria, noted his presence there in her personal diary. He was surrounded by family, guests, and servants. It is, perhaps, the best alibi in the history of true crime. For the final, most gruesome murder of Mary Jane Kelly on November 9th, he was back in London, but his day was packed with official engagements in front of numerous witnesses. Based on the evidence, it is not just unlikely, but physically impossible for Prince Eddy to have been Jack the Ripper. The myth persists not because of any factual basis, but because it combines two of the Victorian era's greatest obsessions: the mystery of the royal family and the mystery of the Whitechapel murders. It is a work of historical fiction, a modern conspiracy theory projected onto a convenient, tragic, and enigmatic royal figure. This, perhaps, is the real tragedy of Prince Albert Victor. The modern re-examination of his life suggests he was not a dunce prince, but a young man struggling with likely neurological challenges stemming from his premature birth, perhaps a learning disability or mild deafness. In an age that had no understanding of these conditions, he was simply labeled a failure. And it was this established public perception of a gentle but troubled prince, a man set up to fail, that created the fertile ground for these baseless scandals to take root and define his legacy forever. By the winter of 1891, the constant anxiety surrounding Prince Eddy seemed at last to be subsiding. After years of drifting through a series of structured but ultimately unfulfilling experiences, from his naval training to his time at Cambridge and in the army, the royal family and the government had deployed their final and most powerful tool for stabilizing a wayward prince: a suitable marriage. This strategy was rooted in Victorian royal tradition, where unions were arranged not just for personal happiness, but to secure alliances, bolster reputations, and ensure dynastic continuity, as seen in previous matches like Queen Victoria's own to Prince Albert in 1840. The chosen bride was a German princess who had grown up in England, Princess Victoria Mary of Teck, born on May 26, 1867, at Kensington Palace to Duke Francis of Teck and Princess Mary Adelaide of Cambridge. Her family, though of royal blood, lived in relative financial constraint due to her father's morganatic marriage and lack of inheritance, which meant May had been raised with a practical education in household management, languages, and history, often assisting her mother in charitable work for London's poor through organizations like the London Needlework Guild, where he was gentle and easygoing, traits noted in letters from his army friends describing his preference for quiet conversations over boisterous activities. She was serious and reserved, having developed a composed demeanor from years of navigating her family's social demotions, including a brief exile to Florence in 1883 to escape creditors, where he was intellectually disengaged, as evidenced by his tutor's reports of minimal engagement in studies. She was intelligent, well-read, and possessed a deep, almost formidable understanding of royal history and duty, having studied genealogies and constitutional matters under governesses, and through self-directed reading of works like Walter Bagehot's The English Constitution, 1867. She was not a dazzling beauty in the conventional sense. Contemporary portraits show a tall, slender figure with sharp features and a steady gaze, but she carried herself with an unshakable dignity that the public and, crucially, Queen Victoria found deeply reassuring, as reflected in the Queen's journal entries praising May's strength of character during family gatherings at Balmoral. She was seen as the perfect stabilizing force for the young prince, a woman whose strength and intelligence could guide him and prepare him for the throne that awaited him, much like how Victoria had credited Albert with providing moral guidance during her early reign. The courtship was brief and businesslike, spanning only a few months from their initial encouraged meetings at Balmoral in the summer of 1891. A matter of state more than a matter of the heart, orchestrated by intermediaries like Lady Salisbury, wife of the Prime Minister, to align with political needs for a stable succession amid growing Republican sentiments in Britain. But by all accounts, including letters exchanged between the couple preserved in the royal archives, A genuine, gentle affection began to grow between the two. Eddy was reportedly charmed by May's quiet strength, as he confided in a note to his sister Louise about her calm wisdom during walks in the gardens of White Lodge, Richmond, where May lived. She was touched by his kindness and vulnerability, responding in her diary entries with notes on his tender heart and efforts to make her feel welcomed despite his own insecurities. In December 1891, at the country estate of Luton Hoo in Bedfordshire, owned by Madame de Falbay, he proposed during a house party arranged specifically for the occasion, kneeling in the drawing room amid winter decorations. She accepted immediately, sealing the arrangement with a kiss as recounted in family correspondence. The engagement was announced to the world on December 3rd, 1891, via a court circular in the Times, and was greeted with a national sigh of relief. The press was ecstatic, with publications like the Illustrated London News running special editions with engravings of the couple and editorials, hailing it as a union of promise. Newspapers that had once whispered about his scandals, such as veiled references in Punch to his social escapades, now printed glowing portraits of the happy couple, emphasizing May's virtues and Eddy's improved demeanor post-India tour. The future of the monarchy, which had seemed so precarious amid Bertie's ongoing indiscretions and Eddy's perceived inadequacies, now appeared safe and secure. A grand royal wedding was set for February 27th, 1892, at St. George's Chapel, Windsor, with preparations including a guest list of over 1,000, a trousseau designed by Worth of Paris featuring a white satin gown embroidered with silver, and public celebrations planned across the empire, from fireworks in Sydney to illuminations in Calcutta. But that wedding would never take place. In January 1892, the royal family gathered at Sandringham House in Norfolk, their private country retreat purchased in 1862 and renovated into a sprawling estate with 365 rooms symbolizing Victorian domesticity to celebrate Prince Eddy's 28th birthday on January 8th. The atmosphere was festive, full of the hope and promise of the upcoming wedding, with activities including shooting parties on the estate's 20,000 acres, family dinners featuring game from the hunts, and discussions of honeymoon plans to the continent. But a deadly influenza virus had also entered the house. At the time, the world was in the final throes of a brutal influenza pandemic known as the Russian flu, which originated in St. Petersburg in 1889 and had swept across the globe in multiple waves, infecting up to 40% of populations in affected areas and killing over 1 million people worldwide by 1892, including notable figures like the Duke of Clarence's own cousin, Prince Baudouin of Belgium, who died from it in 1891. The virus, likely H2N2 or H3N8 subtype, based on modern analyses, spread rapidly through railways and steamships, causing symptoms from fever to respiratory failure, with mortality rates higher among the young and those with pre-existing conditions. Just days after his birthday on January 9th, Prince Eddy complained of feeling unwell, initially dismissing it as a chill from outdoor activities in the cold Norfolk weather. He had caught the flu. At first, no one was overly concerned, as initial symptoms were mild, a sore throat and headache, treated with bed rest and tonics by the family physician Sir William Broadbent. But his condition rapidly worsened over the next 48 hours, with high fever reaching 104 degrees Fahrenheit, severe coughing, and shortness of breath indicating the influenza had developed into severe pneumonia, a common complication in the era before antibiotics, where bacterial superinfections like streptococcus often proved fatal. The nation's best doctors were summoned to Sandringham, including Sir William Gull, former physician to Queen Victoria, and Dr. Francis Laking, who arrived by special train from London on January 11th, administering oxygen via primitive cylinders and prescribing quinine and brandy stimulants. But there was little they could do beyond palliative care in the absence of ventilators or antivirals. For a week from January 9th to 14th, the royal family kept a grim vigil as the future King of England fought for his life, rotating shifts at his bedside in the Blue Room, a chamber decorated with family portraits and overlooking the gardens. The nation, which had just been celebrating his engagement through newspaper announcements and public toasts, now waited anxiously, reading the somber medical bulletins that were posted outside Marlborough House in London every few hours, detailing his restless nights and labored breathing, which fueled prayer services in churches across Britain. The accounts from inside Sandringham, particularly from Queen Victoria's own diary entries dated January 10th to 15th, 1892, preserved in the Royal Archives, paint a heartbreaking picture of the scene. His parents Bertie and Alexandra remained constant presences, with Alexandra holding his hand through delirious episodes. His younger brother George, recently recovered from typhoid himself in 1891, sat reading psalms. His sisters, Louise, Victoria, and Maud, offered comforts like cool cloths, and his distraught fiancée, May, who had arrived on January 12th, prayed silently, her composure cracking in private moments as noted in her later letters. In moments of delirium, caused by high fever spiking to 105 degrees, Eddy reportedly cried out, not for his new fiancée, but for a previous woman he had loved, likely Hélène d'Orléans, the French princess he had pursued in 1890 but was denied due to religious differences, a sign of his mind wandering back through his short and often unhappy life, filled with unfulfilled romances and familial pressures. His mother, Alexandra, who had always been his fiercest protector since advocating for leniency during his childhood struggles, was inconsolable, weeping openly and refusing food, as described by attendants in household memos. The end came on the morning of January 14th, 1892, at 9:35 a.m. With his family gathered around his bed, including Bertie administering last rites and Alexandra cradling his head, Prince Albert Victor, Duke of Clarence and Avondale, titles granted in 1890, died from cardiac failure secondary to pneumonia, as certified on his death certificate. The news was a profound shock to the nation, announced via telegraph to London, and triggering black-bordered editions of newspapers like The Times, which ran headlines like Death of the Duke of Clarence, National Mourning. An entire generation had grown up knowing him as their future king, with his image in school books and public portraits. The outpouring of public grief was immense, with thousands sending condolence letters to the palace, shops closing in respect, and memorial services held in cathedrals, from Westminster Abbey to St. Paul's. His funeral was a major state occasion on January 20th. His coffin, draped in the Union Jack and topped with his coronet, carried through the frozen streets of Windsor on a gun carriage, a solemn procession that included foreign royals like Kaiser Wilhelm II, and over 100,000 mourners lining the route, symbolizing the death of a nation's future amid tolling bells and muffled drums. Queen Victoria, who had already buried a husband in 1861 and 2 grandchildren earlier, was devastated, confining herself to Balmoral and writing in her diary on January 14th, "To lose another dear grandchild is a terrible blow. The poor parents are in a terrible state of grief," reflecting her compounded sorrow. But for Eddy's mother, Alexandra, the loss was unbearable, leading to prolonged depression. For the rest of her life until 1925, she would keep his room at Sandringham exactly as he had left it, with his clothes in the wardrobe, books on the shelves, and even his half-smoked cigarettes in the ashtray. A private, heartbreaking shrine to her lost son, visited annually on his birthday with fresh flowers. Amidst the genuine grief, however, the prince's death had an immediate and profound consequence for the British monarchy. In an instant, the line of succession had been irrevocably altered, shifting the burden to George, who became second in line after Bertie, accelerating plans for his preparation as heir presumptive. While the nation mourned the tragic young prince through black armbands and half-masted flags across the empire, it is likely that many in the corridors of power, ministers like Lord Salisbury, and courtiers at Buckingham Palace felt a quiet and perhaps guilty sense of relief, as internal memos from the Home Office in January 1892 subtly noted the stability afforded by the change, given Eddy's perceived unpreparedness. The problem of Eddy had been solved by a cruel twist of fate, removing uncertainties about his fitness amid ongoing rumors. In his place stood George, a man who was, by character and training, perfectly suited to the role of a modern constitutional monarch. He was solid, with a no-nonsense approach honed in naval service. Dependable, having demonstrated loyalty during family crises. Conservative, aligning with Victorian values, and deeply committed to his duty, a safe pair of hands to guide the nation through the turbulent decades that lay ahead, including the Boer War, 1899 to 1902, Edwardian reforms, and World War I. Eddy's death also created a deeply unusual and awkward dynastic situation. Princess May of Teck had been chosen and approved to be the future queen consort. Her engagement ring, a sapphire surrounded by diamonds, already a symbol of continuity. She was now left in a state of limbo, her royal future seemingly erased, residing quietly at White Lodge with her parents amid public sympathy expressed in letters and visits from royals. But Queen Victoria, ever the pragmatist with a keen eye on succession, saw a solution in repurposing the match for stability. After a suitable period of shared mourning, during which George and May bonded over grief at Sandringham, exchanging letters of consolation, Victoria actively encouraged a match between May and the new heir, Prince George, through discreet family meetings in the spring of 1893. A year later, on July 6, 1893, he proposed in the garden at Sheen Lodge, Richmond, and she accepted, leading to their wedding on July 6, 1893, at the Chapel Royal St. James's Palace, attended by 10 bridesmaids and featuring a cake topped with naval motifs. It was a union born directly from tragedy and dynastic necessity, with the press framing it as a romance from sorrow. Yet this arranged marriage would become one of the most successful and enduring royal partnerships in British history, lasting until George's death in 1936. They would become King George V and Queen Mary upon Bertie's death in 1910, the widely respected monarchs who would lead Britain through the First World War, implementing measures like the 1917 name change to Windsor from Saxe-Coburg-Gotha amid anti-German sentiment, the Great Depression, with George's radio broadcasts fostering national unity, and the rise of fascism, navigating abdication crises. They were the grandparents of Queen Elizabeth II through their son George VI, and they set the modern template for royal duty and stability, emphasizing public service and family image. It is one of history's greatest ironies. The stable, modern House of Windsor, as we know it today, was made possible only by the tragic early death of Prince Eddy. The life of Prince Albert Victor is a story defined more by what he wasn't than by what he was. He was not the brilliant heir his family and nation had hoped for. He was not the scandal-free prince who could restore the monarchy's moral authority. And most significantly, he was not the king he was born to be. He remains one of the great what-ifs of British history. Had that influenza virus not taken him in 1892, he, not his brother George, would have been king during the First World War and the tumultuous years that followed. Would his perceived weaknesses and instability have damaged the monarchy at its most vulnerable moment? Or would the responsibilities of the crown have transformed him into the leader he was always meant to be? It's a question we can never answer. His true legacy is a tragic and cautionary one. It's a story about the crushing weight of royal expectation and how a person's character can be posthumously assassinated by rumor and slander. He is remembered today not for the gentle and kind man he seems to have been, but for the dark and sensational scandals he most likely had nothing to do with. In the end, Prince Eddy remains a ghost in the royal story. He is a faint and melancholic figure, forever standing in the shadows behind the throne. He is the prince who was almost king, a young man whose sad short life was perhaps best summed up by the inscription his grieving mother chose for his tomb: "Here at last I shall rest with thee, here in Christ I shall sleep in peace."